Okay, I'll speak very loud. I did one of these a couple of weeks ago and I woke up the morning of the presentation with the world's worst sore throat, and I looked around my phone for other people in the office who might be able to cover me, and there weren't. So I'm fine booming today. It was a bit harder 2 or 3 weeks ago. So I work for Protiviti. I'll introduce it in a minute. I normally start off with this slide. So I think we've got a captive audience. Everyone's come today for the topic of GDPR. Clearly, sometimes do this presentation for an audience who GDPR might have been inserted in a slot in in a conference for another topic. Those individuals are quite often have to be convinced about wanting to talk about GDPR. I'm sure you've all received hundreds. I think someone said to me they'd received thousands of privacy notices. So for some audiences, we're more welcome than others in terms of coming to the GDPR topic in the run-up to the 25th of May. So this is what we're going to talk today, and it dovetails nicely into some of the presentations this morning. So these are the foundations of GDPR, and we wanted to talk about just 2 of them specifically. They've been outlined at a high level by some of the other speakers. So first of all, we want to cover how you understand your business through data mapping. We see quite a lot of clients who have sort of followed the requirements of Article 30, but are not necessarily getting a lot of value, and arguably maybe missing stuff within their record of processing as well. So how you can think about doing that in a slightly different way. And the second topic is data processor risk. We see a lot of clients, because lots of programs are led by legal teams, the obvious place to start, and the right place to start, is looking at contracts. But the vendor due diligence is a lot harder to address. It's perhaps a lot more unstructured in many organisations, and we see many organisations have parked that vendor due diligence activity until after May 25th. I'll just pass on to Hirun. We also, I guess the other topic which we will cover in the data mapping is just an appreciation of some of the tools. I want to declare we're not a reseller for any of these tools, but for those who've taken a manual approach, there are some tools out there that can help you. We're not going to promise, as some of the vendors do, that they will solve your GDPR problems, as somebody mentioned this morning, but they can be useful for certain organisations. And I'll hand over to Hirun to cover the data mapping.
Hi everyone, I'm Hirun from Protiviti, and in this session I'll be talking about data mapping methodology, how you can translate your record processing activities into something much more tangible and productive for the business to use. Before I jump into our data mapping, or the top-down assessment, what we like to call it, what I want to bring to your attention is GDPR Article 30 requirements. Most of you should be familiar with these requirements, so I won't go through this in very much detail. But what it says is that as a data controller or a processor, you need to be documenting what personal data you hold, where is it coming from, who do you share it with, and things like retention periods and technical controls to safeguard your personal data. Moving on, how many of you have completed the record of processing here? Okay. All right. So this is a high-level example of what a record of processing or a data processing inventory might look like. As you can see, it's a very flat file structure with the Article 30 requirements mapped against it. And this is a typical example that we would see in most of our clients. Moving on. So you might ask me, okay, so what is wrong with just doing the record of processing or the data processing inventory? Now, when we started our GDPR projects, whether it be compliance or remediation programs over the last year or so, what we saw was that populating the record of processing was very much a tick in the box exercise that didn't really add a lot of value to the business. Because the Article 30 doesn't really mandate that you document your high-risk activities or your systems inventory or identify and manage your risk and control areas. So what we thought was by visualizing your data, personal data lifecycle as it travels through the organization from process to process to system, vendors, you can get so much more value out of it. So in this session, what I'd like to talk to you about is through the data mapping exercise, which can be coupled with the bottom-up scanning exercise, you can not only achieve regulatory compliance, but you can identify and manage your high-risk areas and also get a lot more value out of it. What I also want to say is that the ICO actually recommends that you do an information audit or a data mapping exercise. So our methodology is actually very much in line with what the ICO recommends. I'll go through how we would conduct a top-down assessment or a data mapping exercise. Now, this is a methodology that we've actually used across different types of organizations, different scales from multinational to small to medium enterprises. The way that the methodology works is we would engage with the senior management team or the executive team, understand what your business structure looks like, so whether it be things like HR, finance, operations, customer services and things like that, which gives us a high level, sort of level 0 understanding of your business. Then we would engage with business stakeholders, normally head of business, and ask, okay, in terms of what are the areas that you would normally process personal data in a material way? And then we can do that through questionnaires, workshops, one-on-one meetings, and we'd identify these high-risk areas, so things like HR, customer services, marketing comes into play. And then this is where we would prioritize our data mapping exercise, because not every business function needs to be mapped from the start. I mean, it's something that you can go back and do it, but this is how a top-down risk assessment works. As part of this, we would also document what your structured data repositories are. So these are your typical databases, applications, systems, and things like that. And we would document this in our data maps. What we could also do is augment the data mapping exercise with a data scanning exercise. So the data scanning involves looking for your unstructured data that might be scattered across your organization. And this is a classic problem that most of our clients have, because of the number of legacy systems that they have, or the way that they've gone through M&A activities. They've collected all this data, which is sitting in a range of sources that they don't really have a good understanding of. So what we would typically do in our unstructured data scanning process is, so unstructured data, by that I mean anything that's sitting outside your databases or your applications. So things like CV files, payroll files, salary files. I mean, one good example is HR manager downloading a bonus file and then sending it out to managers in different countries. And this is something that we normally uncover during our data scanning exercise or data mapping exercise. Then we would pinpoint what those data points are and then use a data loss prevention tool or a data scanning tool to scan across these areas. I won't go through this data scanning methodology in detail, but please feel free to speak to myself or Phil after the session if you want to know more detail about it. So in a nutshell, this is what our top-down and bottom-up approach looks like. Now, some of our clients, what we've seen is they've tried to map hundreds and hundreds of processes over the past year or so without really focusing on what the high-risk areas are. In fact, with one of our clients, we're actually helping them re-engineer their ROP, which has hundreds and hundreds of line items, which is not really something practical to upkeep. And we're actually helping them with this top-down approach to reverse engineer it back to something high level that they can actually keep and maintain. So these are just a way of showing that, as part of the data mapping exercise, we'll also highlight what those data scanning points are as well. So moving on, what does an actual data map look like? We've heard about the data mapping, sort of what it is, something that we recommend to our clients. This is a very high-level extraction of what record processing looks like with the PII categories or data subject. what we would typically do is we would engage with the business and actually flow chart or do a whiteboard session to understand who are your key data subject, where is the data coming from, what are the means of collection, are they coming through emails, phone calls, through a mobile app, and we would actually document that with the business in the room. We would understand what are the different business processes that it might go through. There are so many ways that the personal data might be traveling across the organization, going from system to system, or system to database, and this is where we also highlight, okay, are there points where you are downloading or sending out unstructured data formats that is personal data. So these are some information that you might not necessarily capture as part of your ROP. One of the key requirements of GDPR is making sure that you safeguard your data, especially if it's leaving the EEA. This is another good way of showing that, by the way, these are the data transfer arrangements that we have in place. And this actually gets the business to think about, oh, actually, I've got data going out to outside the EEA. One of the classic examples we've come across is my data is going out to South America, but I don't actually know if there's the right safeguards or the right level of data protection agreements in place. So that's a very common example that we're seeing. We also note down the risk observations as part of this exercise. So things like I said, data protection agreements. Do you have the right technical controls like data encryption in place when you do share this personal data? And we also ask questions like, when you're collecting this data from a data subject, do you actually how do you manage your consent? So there's a lot more information and insight you're gathering as part of this data mapping exercise. This is I wanted to give you an example of how we go on about doing a data map. This highlights what are the different data subjects, and this is something that we can replicate across clients as well, because whether it be retail or manufacturing, the data subjects tend to be quite similar. Employees, customers, third parties, and if the data is going out to external agents, it could be government agencies, IT vendors. How do you collect personal data, the areas that you collect, that you store your data, and different types of data flows. This is a finished product of what a data map typically looks like. As you can see, the data subject is there. There's a different data sharing arrangement with Spain, and you can see straight away that, okay, my personal data is going to Spain. Do I have the right level of controls in place? The different systems, different databases, and so on. Who's completed the data mapping exercise here? Okay, it's good to see. So, in summary, one of the things that you can get out from doing a data map is you can visualize your business personal data lifecycle in a much more effective way that the business can understand. You're putting a collection of systems, processes, vendors, and systems in a much more structured way that the ROP might not be able to do. You're also collecting a lot more information about your risk areas, things like, do I have the right safeguards in place to protect my data when it leaves the organization? Do I have the right technical controls in place? How do I manage consent? And these are things that we collect along the way as part of the business engagement. And what we typically see is we get a lot more responses out of the business stakeholders because you're speaking to them in their own language. It also gives you a very good linkage into other work streams, things like the DPIA, because you have now a system inventory, you have an understanding about your high-risk data processing activities, and also we can sometimes collect information about projects as well. Given that you have an understanding about what your personal data is sitting because of the data map, it is quite easy to respond back to, depending on the scale of the organization, it is sometimes easier to respond back to data subject access requests because you actually have an understanding where your personal data is sitting. So what it does is, it lays this good foundation on good data governance practices for the years to come. With that, I'll hand over to Phil, who's going to speak to you about some of the tools and technologies that's coming up.
Thanks, Hirun. So I think one of the things that I've taken away from this approach, and I think you mentioned it in the previous presentation, was about user engagement. You know, privacy is not forefront of their day job. You wouldn't expect it to be. They are an operations manager, they are a marketeer, they're an HR person. And actually, by really engaging them in a two-way, so typically how we do this is very much a whiteboarding exercise. It's not a series of people coming in and writing a load of notes feeling like someone's being audited. It's very much a two-way process. And the feedback we've had is it really sparks the interest of the users, particularly in organisations which perhaps don't have so much internal audit, perhaps are a little bit more immature in terms of their data governance. That actually we've had feedback, wow, forget GDPR, like I've learned something about my business like that I didn't know before. You know, the example about South America really worried them, because not only did they not know that the data was going to South America, but they didn't know which country it was. So they had no way of developing the data transfer agreements because they didn't know about it. And similarly, like working alongside the legal teams, the lawyers are drafting the transfer agreements, but unless they know all the places to draft those transfer agreements, you're going to have an incomplete picture. So we've worked alongside, you know, we're providing the operational support. We're working very closely with the legal teams to do the contract processes, to do the transfer agreements, etc., which is clearly where their skill set lies. So we wanted to just mention a few tools. As I said, we're not aligned to any specific tool, but there are some tools out there that may be able to help you. Some of you may have implemented some of these tools. Others of you may be looking to mature your programs and perhaps have relied on lots of manual processes, but those are starting to build up and you're looking to drive efficiency. So OneTrust's one. If there was one tool I would expect many of you in the room to have been heard. They've done a very good job. If you go to any privacy conference, they're probably sponsoring it, so they've done a very good job of marketing themselves. All of these tools are maturing, I would say, but they've got a very broad set of capabilities. So they're not doing the scanning, but they're providing a lot of the governance and processes. So it started with creating a record of processing, but you can also build in your subject access request process and the workflow associated to that. You can build your data breach response process. Now you can do these things in other systems if you have an incident management system. Some people are using ServiceNow and IT incident systems, but it provides you a tool out there. And if you want to bring your whole privacy story together, which will support you should the ICO ever come in, then it just helps to bring that into one place. One to consider. Another tool that's perhaps less well known, but is quite unique in terms of what we've seen, is called TrustHub. So TrustHub, rather than creating a flat database, has created a very visual way to create record processing. So you'll see here, so this probably doesn't show it particularly well, but I always describe TrustHub. If you ever watch Homeland or any of those American sort of NSA, you know, type shows, and you see the communications going around the world and being tracked by the NSA, TrustHub has built a whole database in a visual format. So rather than being a flat relational database, it's built up with nodes. So the whole thing looks like some big NSA diagram. And you can, it's very, very powerful. So you can bring all your systems in here, all your geographies, you can bring risk and control frameworks from your GRC tool. So it's come at it from a very, very different angle to OneTrust, but quite powerful, particularly if you're a multi-jurisdiction organisation, lots of cross-border transfers, and lots of data flying around the world that might be impacted by GDPR. So another tool just to sort of consider. I'm not going to show the video, so we'll move on. So I just want to reflect on the data processing risk. As I said before, this is an area that we think a lot of organisations have probably done less work around. This is a bit of a history. So we do a lot of work in the vendor risk space, and that predated GDPR. What you'll notice, so this is lots of the regulations around vendor risk management. What you'll notice, I know it's pretty small, is that many of those regulations are US driven. So what we've observed is that the US market for vendor risk management is far more mature than it is over in Europe, and that's predominantly driven by quite prescriptive regulations in the US in terms of what you need to do for vendor risk management. If you're in the financial services sector, you know, the FCA has started to pay more attention to outsourcing risk and some of the risk that brings to the organisation, but it's still quite a high level set of guidance, so it doesn't provide you a lot of detail in terms of what you do in relation to vendor risk management. So some of the regulated organisations have had oversight from the FCA, but GDPR is bringing in the need for vendor due diligence on a much bigger scale to a load of previously unregulated industries, many of which vendor risk management is a lot more immature. So, for anyone who follows US dramas, that's our new Duchess in the Suits drama. So this is the area that we see lots of programs that are a lot further advanced along. Not everyone has done all their contract reviews. Clearly, you know, you're very dependent on your suppliers to agree to your new GDPR terms. So we don't see lots of organisations who are 100% complete, but many programs are pretty advanced. They knew that they had to put new contractual terms in, and because many of the programs are led by lawyers, that's obviously a sweet spot that lawyers are very, very familiar with and very practiced in terms of renegotiating contracts alongside procurement, obviously. So the other aspect of Article 28 relates to compliance with your obligations, and specifically the completing of audits. So how are you going to get comfort over your third-party risk? That's more than just contractually having an awareness, but also giving yourself some assurance over those third parties. Interestingly, there's a lot of debate in the third-party risk community, a pressure to get into not just third parties, but fourth parties and nth parties. And GDPR does make reference to mapping out of your sub-processes, not just your processes. So whilst it doesn't tell you what you need to do in vendor risk management, it does specifically acknowledge that you need to understand the full supply chain. So the example I think someone gave before, you know, you may be buying, you know, Salesforce is probably not a good example, but let's use Salesforce. So you might be buying Salesforce, they're your third party. Salesforce may be being hosted on the Microsoft cloud somewhere, that would be your fourth party. They may be using backup services that could be going to another country, that would be your fifth party. Now GDPR is not going to tell you how far you go, but it is saying you need to have an understanding of this sub-processor framework. And then it is a risk decision as to how far you take it in terms of due diligence. So, why is this more and more complicated? So, as I've kind of alluded, more and more of the risk of an organisation is sitting outside of your boundaries. So for some organisations, more and more of its privacy risk is sitting outside of the boundary. Yet we haven't necessarily done a load of due diligence to get ourselves comfortable about the processes that those processes are operating on our behalf. So here are some of the impacts of poor risk management. So it's been mentioned before, the regulatory risk associated is sort of well known. If you're in a regulated industry, financial services, the FCA works very closely in partnership with the ICO. So to the question earlier, will you be audited by the ICO? If you're in financial services, you're more likely to be audited by the FCA, who are operating on behalf of the ICO. They have a much bigger regulatory supervisory team. There's clearly a legal risk under GDPR, so you can be sued, and there's potentially costly remediation. And then lastly, the not too cryptic reference that you can probably work out. There's a reputational risk. So I'm sure you all recognise that particular brand. I won't declare it, but there's very significant reputational risks to that organisation at the moment, which potentially go far beyond the 4% fine. The damage to their brand is quite considerable. Interestingly, in that particular case, this was something that happened before GDPR, but then a response happened post-GDPR and actually caused a GDPR breach. So third-party due diligence. So what are we supposed to be thinking about? So these are many of the questions that, if your organisation already has third-party due diligence, they will be asking already. I guess the tweaking here is that to date, where organisations have third-party risk, they're potentially thinking about financial risk. They're probably thinking about information security risk. But it's making sure that your privacy impact assessment and the associated questions to that are embedded into understanding your vendors. So are you asking the right privacy questions to your third parties? So this is going beyond what you contractually oblige on them, but to really understand which of your vendors hold personal data, first of all. Then secondly, do you understand the processes they're following? So we see a number of issues in the industry in relation to third-party risk. I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but essentially where we do see vendor risk management, we see quite poor follow-up. So even some of the big financial services organisations who spend quite a lot of money on vendor risk management, we see a lot of very manual processes. Someone actually presented at a conference last week and said, you know, we have a whole team doing a load of audits, they create a load of actions, I'm not necessarily convinced anyone does anything with those actions. So you might have ticked the box that you're doing due diligence, but if you're not doing anything and you're not remediating and you're not working with your vendors, it's a pretty worthless exercise. And this is one of the approaches in terms of building an effective vendor risk management program. We do believe in trying to digitise this. Historically, this has been done in a very spreadsheet-driven process for many organisations. For those of you that have GRC risk and control platforms already, some of even basically recording your actions and remediation plans and the controls that you expect your vendors to comply with, which will include privacy risks, even capturing that within your GRC platform is much better and more efficient than driving this through a spreadsheet-based approach. So, just as key takeaways from that I wanted to highlight. So, much of your privacy risk sits outside the organisation. So this is an important activity for you to get comfortable with your overall privacy risk. I think the ICO recognises that everybody is on a journey, but this is definitely something that we see that organisations that are immature in this space do need to think about after the 25th of May. It's going to require a lot more focus. The financial services organisations in the UK, where we see this is probably most mature, they've still got stuff to do, because one of the challenges they have is many of them talk about tens of thousands of vendors, so their problem is massive. You may have 25, you may have 50 critical vendors, depending on the size of your organisation, you might have a few hundred, but clearly it's a lot easier to get your hands around the sort of scale of that problem. But it is going to require greater discipline around vendor risk management, particularly in Europe, where we see a more immature environment in this space. It does have an impact on many aspects of your remediation. So as I mentioned before, having the right transfer agreements in place, that is driven by making sure you understand where all your data is flowing. You do need to embed data protection impact assessments into your vendor processes. Privacy policies and privacy notices. So the gentleman earlier from Lloyd's was very proud of his privacy notice. Do organisations, have they sent all that information so that your vendors understand your privacy stance? We're increasingly starting to get queries from data processors who are trying to understand the culture of their customer because where they set their GDPR risk tolerance may be driven by their customers, but they're not necessarily always open to having a transparent dialogue with their customer for fear that they're going to declare that they're non-compliant and end up with potential service breaches. And lastly, joint testing. So if your organisation has very heavy reliance on vendors, you really need to be thinking post 25th of May about how you test some of these processes. And many of you would have got in DPOs. We see there's been a massive influx of recruitment of DPOs in April and May. These are some of the things that your DPOs are going to be pushing organisations to do. Now, if you only test your internal processes, if you're reliant on key vendors to report within your 72-hour window, if they don't report to you for 48 hours, your ability to actually report to the ICO in 72 is going to be challenging. Now, lawyers are having debates about when the clock for 72 hours starts. Is it from the time that the vendor tells me, or is it from the time that, and I've heard multiple lawyers argue this point back and forth, so I don't think it's fully been decided exactly when that clock starts. But it's still going to be important for you to have very, very integrated joint processes, and that is going to require joint testing. So in exactly the same way that people in the business continuity world talk about joint testing of business continuity plans with your key vendors, we just see this as another business continuity event. You're going to need to test some of these key processes. Similarly to the subject access request process, you need to know that your vendor has the right systems to be able to do discovery, to be able to go through their systems and be able to present to you in a reasonable time frame within that 30-day period for you to respond to that subject access request process. So that's kind of what we wanted to cover today. I'm happy to take questions. I'm conscious that I'm stopping you from getting to your lunch, but happy to take questions nonetheless.
I think we've got time for about 5 minutes of questions, so from come in the middle,
yeah, sure.
The video and camera on. Right, gentleman at the back there, go first.
I'm just curious about your experience of the implementation of OneTrust. I'm aware that at least 2 organisations, one very big e-commerce player, who had to abandon their OneTrust implementation very close to the deadline because it just wasn't delivering.
Yeah.
That's what I'm hearing from fellow DPAs is that OneTrust just isn't working for them. Just wonder if you've seen any successful implementations.
I think in some cases some of the marketing came before the implementation, it's fair to say. I think we've done quite a lot of work with the record processing and building that out, but some of the other modules are reasonably immature in terms of the other modules that they're highly publicising. So I do agree with your analysis. It's not a perfect solution that's going to resolve everything. I think many of the vendors are going through similar. So many of the tools, some vendors have converted. So Office 365, for example, Microsoft has declared a whole suite of GDPR services. Many of those are existing products which deal with some aspects of GDPR remediation. They're not necessarily new products. They've rebranded them, obviously, to sell them to this growing market. But those products aside, I think all of the GDPR-specific products are going through a maturity phase, and I concur. It's not going to be the silver bullet, but it does probably provide one of the fullest suites of services. There's many point solutions that are trying to address GDPR. They are trying to deal with the breadth, and I think perhaps with that comes some teething problems.
And got a question front there.
Your data mapping approach sounds really great. I love all this stuff. I did this for SOX many years ago.
Yeah.
But what happened was people just created visual charts. So I was involved in all this for ABN AMRO actually. Across 22 business lines, we created Visio flow charts. We looked at controls obviously as well, but the problem was that nobody actually maintained it. So it was kept somewhere, and nobody made sure it's updated in the fall. So how can you guarantee that this time it won't happen with GDPR?
Yeah. So one of the things that we do with our clients is actually collate all these data maps into a process document. So it's actually sitting in one document with your typical version controlling, your ownership, your dates and numbers and things like that. So one way of tackling that is actually collating that into a process document and then either nominating champions throughout the organization. So each business line will have an owner that looks after that data map. So that worked really well with some of our clients.
I would also say that is an obvious risk. I think the risk is even greater for a record processing on a standalone, because the record processing provides a totally privacy view of the lens of the world that doesn't necessarily mean anything to a business person. So there is a cost to compliance in exactly the same way there was with SOX.
Yeah.
But actually we've had much better engagement with the visual approach than just giving them, because with OneTrust you can send out flat questionnaires, and one of the things we've seen, they're sort of needed in very, very large organisations. There's no way to go around and interview everybody, it's just not feasible. But the challenge with deploying the OneTrust type of questionnaire approach is the quality of some of the data you get. You know, you're sending it to somebody in Taiwan, you know, they don't necessarily understand privacy, and the quality of the responses is very, very variable. So I totally agree with your point that there is a challenge there, but I think because they're written in business language, they're more understandable and the business has engaged in them a lot better than a database, if you see what I mean.
And maybe it should be turned into something like a policy or attached to a wider policy so that you have an annual review.
Absolutely, it's going to need to be embedded into BAU processes. I mean, Trust Hub is trying to address that problem, because effectively what it's done is it's combining the database and the visual Visio into a single entity structure, and they're starting to have quite a lot of success with bigger complex organisations, because the ability to map visually is much more appealing to the business.
I think there's a good argument there for that actually feeding into your overall approach to data governance.
Yeah.
So it's not just a policy, a document on a shelf.
Yeah.
The data governance should be BAU. It should be what drives the data approaches within the organisation. Yeah. However is appropriate for your organisation. It's going to be at a strategic level.
If you have a chief data officer or somebody,
correct,
should sign off on an annual basis, because otherwise it gets lost, all this work that you put into documenting it.
That and or enterprise risk management, so embedding it into your risk management processes in the same way that people attest to SOX every year. They need to attest that these things are up to date.
Do you think that because GDPR is about personal data, people can relate to it because it affects them too, and that helps to drive engagement within organisations?
It's probably varied in the organisations we've had. So we've got a whole mixture of B2C and B2B businesses. I think there's more struggle in B2B because I think GDPR, you know, a work email address is still personal data, but people struggle a little bit more. I think in the in a utility organisation, people really get that and they expect something from their utility company or their tech provider because they understand that personal data. It's been slightly harder in B2B businesses because I think and the risk decision is harder because where do you set that benchmark? And we've had discussions with clients about how much of this mapping do we do across an organisation. Interestingly, when we went to Germany for this particular client, their tolerance to have any risk decisions in the data mapping, I mean, this was the example of, I mean, Hirun said very significant. I think this one organisation, it's not massive, but the German entity alone had created a record of processing that was 400 rows high. And their ability to sustainably keep that up to date is almost impossible. Like you're creating a data map down to fields in a database. But I think it does depend on the type of organisation.
Okay, I think we're about out of time, so it's now lunchtime now. So just like to join me in thanking Hirun and Philip. Lunch should be outside. We'll be back in 1:30.